Death and grief are an inextricable part of horror. The loss of life, not only our own, but of those we love the most, is a terrible thing. But in horror, we can find a way to confront it, to stare it in the eyes, and maybe to even defeat it for a moment. Some horror places the idea of death into a corporeal, containable form, but some allow these abstract concepts to distort reality like a nightmare. It's that kind of nightmare that's bottled within Don Coscarelli's micro-budgeted, ramshackle 1979 indie horror film, Phantasm. A strange brew of deep-seated fears and unreplicable mistakes. Together, they form a concoction of feverish ideas and unforgettable images that have stayed in the minds of fans for more than 40 years. If we look closely at the cobbled-together production, the stop-and-start franchise that followed, and the fears of familial loss woven throughout, we can better see why the nightmare of Phantasm still haunts us today. Phantasm, first and foremost, is a tale of childhood abruptly ended by a confrontation with death given living form.
Oh shit.
And grief following the death of those who once brought safety and security. It does this through the story of two brothers, young Mike Pearson, played by A. Michael Baldwin, who is being half-heartedly raised by older brother Jody, played by Bill Thornbury, after the death of their parents. When their friend Tommy is killed, Mike soon discovers that the local mortician, known only as the Tall Man and iconically played by Angus Scrimm, is a monstrous being who uses dead bodies for otherworldly purposes and orchestrates the town's many deaths. As the Tall Man begins to stalk Mike, he, Jody, and their friend Reggie, played by Reggie Bannister, fight back. That feels like a pretty straightforward plot, and it is. In fact, there's little plot in Phantasm at all. Any backstory or lore is merely hinted at, and there's plenty of aimless, slower moments that fill out these 89 minutes.
We're hot as love, you know.
But Phantasm has survived in the minds of viewers despite being unavailable for years until its remaster in 2016 because of its nightmarish imagery and trance-like atmosphere of dread. It's never quite clear where dreams end and reality begins for Mike or the viewer, and that's only complicated by an ending that not even 4 sequels can clear up. While that lack of definition between reality and dream may be intentional by Coscarelli, you can also trace much of it back to the haphazard, extremely makeshift nature of Phantasm's production. Despite being released on March 28, 1979, Coscarelli started filming Phantasm in 1977, rushing into production with a small group of friends and actors he'd met while filming his first 2 financially unsuccessful films. With a budget of $300,000 pulled from his father and various local doctors and lawyers who invested in the film, Coscarelli began with part of a script and half a plan. After about 9 days of disorganized production, filming on Phantasm was shut down, soon restarting again to only shoot on weekends, with Coscarelli editing the footage and writing parts of the script during the days in between. "I did have a screenplay written that was barely linear," said Coscarelli. "It established the idea of the brothers, of the mortuary, and of the evil villain, but towards the end it got much more diffuse and unfocused. And when we started shooting, we didn't exactly know what the ending was going to be, so we ended up shooting several different endings for the movie. The ending was chosen over the course of the 8 months of post-production that followed, and plenty of scenes were left on the cutting room floor. Those cuts also strip Phantasm of cohesion and a greater flow between scenes. What's left are moments and images without setup or explanation, furthering the film's dreamlike nature. Why does the Tall Man like to transform into a woman and kill his victims mid-coitus? What purpose do these nasty, Ewok-like crushed-down creatures serve? What's with the fortune-telling elderly woman? What do the giant tuning fork and red dimension mean? The Phantasm sequels would provide some answers, but there are none truly in mind here in the original. The bad acting, often flat lighting, and jerky pacing in Phantasm cannot be denied, but these are offset by the purposeful bad vibes. The unknowableness, the strangeness, the sudden odd terror of it all are what make Phantasm indelible. There's a reason why a flying, shining bringer of death has become the lasting symbol of this franchise. It's incredibly strange and incredibly scary. Phantasm was a success in its release, grossing more than $12 million on its roughly $300,000 budget, mirroring the earlier independent horror success of Halloween. In its wake, Coscarelli went on to make The Beastmaster in 1982, a film that's loved by some.
Let's get this party started!
Who are you?
I am the Beastmaster.
But its small box office in relation to its much larger budget led Coscarelli back to Phantasm. Phantasm 2 arrived in 1988 with a comparatively huge budget of $3 million. To match the much more studio-backed film, Universal Pictures had Coscarelli replace A. Michael Baldwin with much more established actor James LeGros in the role of Mike, and let's face it, LeGros is a much better actor. Phantasm 2 has more guns, chainsaws, and car chases. It's a bigger, much more muscular movie that is still horror, but is much more focused on the fighting back that takes place in the original's final act. Phantasm 3, Lord of the Dead in 1994 brought back Baldwin as Mike, but mostly shifted the focus to fan-favorite character Reggie, originally the comic relief, then the co-lead, and finally the lead for this, Phantasm 4 Oblivion in 1998, and finally Phantasm 5 Ravager in 2016. There's a sense of not exactly knowing where to go with each subsequent sequel. The first film might be Mike's nightmare, but the rest are clearly set in the real world without ever really confirming what actually happened in the original movie. And each film's shocker ending kinda leads nowhere, because they have to be undone for the series to move forward. So what you have is a franchise built across almost 40 years, largely reliant on the original film's most indelible ideas, but without the undertones that birthed those images. Phantasm 2 is a pretty good time, and it's clearly the inspiration for long-running action horror series Supernatural. The classic muscle car, the guns, the fraternal relationship at its center, it's all Phantasm built into something larger. 2 ups the scares and benefits from the budget and stronger performances, but it's all downhill from there. How can you recreate and reiterate the alchemical fears of the first when they seem like such happy coincidence? It's just balls, dwarves, boys, and broken glass. There are many reasons behind why horror attracts such a rabid, dedicated, and often understanding fandom. But chief among these is that, as a genre, it speaks to its viewers in ways that no other type of film can. Horror lets us dig deep down into our primordial, dark fears. The ideas that come to us late at night. The images that flash in our minds when we least expect. These are terrors that may never come true, and some that inevitably come for us all. We all have grieved in some ways, and we all will grieve in times to come. It's inescapable. Horror lets us dip our toes in these dark waters in controlled, sometimes thrilling ways. In a conversation with Dr. Stephen Morans, who helmed the Childhood Violent Trauma Center at Yale University, New Yorker writer Aaron Orbe sought insights into his decades-long obsession with horror films in the wake of his father's murder when he was a toddler. You choose to watch these movies, said Dr. Morans. You can turn away, you can turn down the volume, you can experience the level of arousal, the somatic sense of fear, and know in the back of your mind that it's not forever. We are sometimes drawn compulsively to the very things that scare us, as a method of mastering them. Phantasm traffics heavily in funereal imagery, and it's no mistake. Coscarelli made a horror film because it had a higher chance of success than his previous movies, and picked funerals because of their taboo nature. The result is a story about a young boy losing his family and being confronted, for the first time, by death face to face. Mike and Jody, in their own ways, are grieving their parents, who died in an accident shortly before the start of the film. It causes Mike to try everything to be closer to his big brother, watching him and following him at any spare moment. But it makes Jody run away, planning on leaving the town behind and leaving Mike in the care of family friends. The tall man is the specter of death brought on by their loss, forcing them to confront not only the reality of their parents being gone, but the process of death and burial itself. After a series of escalating, increasingly weird encounters, Mike and Jody return to the tall man's mausoleum near the finale. Inside, they both open the casket of their parents, who are interred at the building. Jody can't bring himself to look, but Mike can, and what he finds is that the bodies are gone. Likely turned into creatures by the tall man. It's a grim notion that isn't expounded upon, but it's a significant confrontation with, and confirmation of, the fact that mom and dad are truly gone forever. As the film progresses, Phantasm becomes stranger and stranger, the darkness closing in more and more. Mike's graveyard dream, a suddenly moving photograph, Jody's mausoleum nightmare, a seemingly psychic connection between the two brothers, the telepathic voiceover of the tall man.
You play a good game, boy, but the game is finished. Now you die.
It's hard to be actually scared by Phantasm 40 years later, especially since its odd pacing keeps the film from ratcheting up tension toward its finale. Instead, it remains strange and unsettling. The presence of death itself begins to grow as well, but not everything in Phantasm has some deeper ties to funeral imagery. The flying sentinel orbs are simply the outgrowth of something Coscarelli saw in a dream. The dwarves are probably just inspired by Star Wars, which came out the same year Phantasm's filming began. You can't really explain these things because Coscarelli simply added them in for their horrifying effect. Their inexplicable nature makes them capture the darkest parts of our imagination. But the simple fact that Phantasm is centered on a strange crypt keeper who traffics in the bodies of the freshly dead means that these all tie into a confrontation with mortality.
Boy!
Mike and Jody defeat the tall man because of their bond, burying him in an abandoned mine shaft. But victory is suddenly lost when Coscarelli reveals that it's all been a dream, a fantasy of Mike's after the car crash death of Jody. It's a big swerve that's rendered even more confusing when the tall man appears in Mike's bedroom. What was real? What was a dream? It's never quite clear, but it shows the story of Phantasm itself to be an exploration and fight with grief. Like our processing of real-life loss through fantastical horror, Mike has created a fiction that lets his brother move past death. But death can never be quite so easily contained. And like the tall man, it returns.